What if everything you've been told about the end times is just the surface, and the true prophecy is hidden behind doors that few dare to open? That's the forbidden question, the one experts avoid, the one scholars evade, the one theologians silence. Not because they don't know, but because they know too much. And this knowledge awakens discomfort, fear, instability. But you're here because you feel there's something beyond, something no one explains, something no one wants to say aloud. And today, we're going to pierce that veil. When we talk about end times prophecies, we enter a territory that disturbs, provokes, and stirs the deepest layers of human curiosity. And amidst this scenario, the same question always insists on echoing: what is really behind the end times? If you feel that the story doesn't add up, that the interpretations seem incomplete, and that there's a strange silence hanging over certain prophetic passages, know that this is not a coincidence. Silence is also a sign. Concealment is also an answer. And whenever someone tries to hide something, that something usually changes everything. There are at least things experts don't want you to know about end times prophecies. And most of these ideas don't appear in sermons, don't appear in academic debates, much less in documentaries that try to simplify the apocalypse. The public feels this, a growing unease, a sense that there is a huge gap between what is said and what is true, the desire to understand what is really happening in the world. The fear of being in the dark, the pain of uncertainty, the frustration of hearing superficial explanations when deep down, everything seems to be moving towards something much bigger. And perhaps that's the point. The greatest danger has never been the end, but not being prepared for it. And I'm not referring to cheap fear, cinematic apocalypse, or collective panic. I'm talking about the profound truth that spans eras, that connects civilizations, that runs through the entire Bible like a line of fire and revelation. The truth that experts know but avoid revealing because it dismantles fragile interpretations, dismantles empty predictions, dismantles comfortable certainties. Behind this silence lies something powerful, something they don't want you to perceive. Something that, if understood, would change the way you see the world, history, and even your own life. Because understanding end times prophecies isn't about predicting dates, calculating signs, or waiting for catastrophes. It's about perceiving patterns, cycles, shadows, warnings, and revelations that are happening now. It's about understanding that the end is not an isolated event. It's a process. And that process is already underway. And you feel it. When you look at the global chaos, the spiritual tensions, the emotional instability of people, the increase in conflicts, the natural disasters, the feeling that something bigger is being orchestrated behind the scenes of history, your instinct screams. None of this is random. None of this is disconnected. None of this is outside the radar of prophecies. But why doesn't anyone talk about this clearly? Why is there so much fear in addressing these points? Because the truth is unsettling. The truth demands a choice. And when you understand what is truly written, you can no longer return to the comfort of ignorance. That's why certain things were silenced. That's why signs were softened. That's why revelations were transformed into metaphors. Because recognizing the reality of the prophecies means acknowledging that we are living through the greatest spiritual turning point in human history, right now. And that's precisely where our video begins. We're going to delve into the areas they avoid, the secrets they hide, the details that change everything. We're going to expose the parts they've never shown you, not for sensationalism, but because you deserve the whole truth. What if everything you've been denied until now is about to be revealed? Stay with me, because what comes next explains why silence has always been the greatest warning. The truth is, there's a prophetic timeline that almost no one shows. Not because it's impossible to understand, but because it dismantles comfortable narratives, dismantles interpretations sold as absolute, dismantles certainties that many people prefer to keep intact. When we talk about ignored prophecies, about passages that have been set aside because they don't fit into the dominant narrative, we enter a forbidden zone, the kind of zone that some experts simply avoid. But you deserve to see what has always been there, hidden right before your eyes. John on the island of Patmos didn't write Revelation merely as a collection of random visions. He delivered an order, a sequence, a spiritual timeline that doesn't begin in chaos, but in revelation. And that's where everything changes. The great mistake is to imagine that Revelation only describes the end, when in fact it describes a process that spans centuries, civilizations, empires, and reaches us. Many of the things John saw are not in the distant future, but in the immediate present, and others are still emerging now as you watch this video. There's something in John's narrative that many people overlook because it's unsettling. The fact that before speaking of the judgments, before speaking of the horses, before speaking of the beast, before speaking of the chaos, John speaks of the throne. He begins in heaven, not on earth. This in itself reveals that the prophetic timeline is not organized by the human perspective, but by the divine perspective. It is heaven that dictates the rhythm of events. It is heaven that marks the beginning of the process. And if it is heaven that initiates, then everything that happens down here is merely the natural response to something that began above us. Now imagine how many times you've heard explanations about the signs of the end times, focused only on wars, crises, disasters, and political conflicts. But John doesn't begin by talking about that. John begins by talking about the glory, the voice that sounded like a trumpet, the lamps, the torches, the sea of glass. And why does this matter? Because the dominant narrative prefers to begin with fear, but the biblical narrative begins with revelation. That changes everything. And here's the part that few explain. John describes an order of events that is not linear in human time, but is linear in spiritual time. He saw the heavens open, saw the throne, saw the Lamb, and only then did he see the seals being broken. This progression shows that events on earth are consequences of something greater being set in motion in the spiritual realm. And this confronts the simplistic view that many experts present, that view that tries to fit everything into human timelines, calendars, and calculations. But John didn't calculate. John witnessed. And this testimony reveals a secret point where history and prophecy intersect. The idea that every important movement in humanity is an echo of something that has already been released in heaven. This changes our interpretation because it takes us out of the position of passive spectators and places us inside history. We are not observing prophecy, we are inside it. And perhaps this is the most uncomfortable part for experts, admitting that some of the events John saw are not in the will happen phase, but in the already happened phase, and others are in the is happening now phase. The problem is that if they admitted this, they would need to acknowledge that the world has already gone through prophetic phases that many still believe are in the future. This undermines theses, undermines doctrines, undermines comfortable interpretations. Therefore, they prefer to ignore entire passages, soften parts that seem too strong, transform details into metaphors to make everything more palatable. But when you read Revelation without filters, you realize there is a constantly moving spiritual dynamic. What John described as seals is not just destruction, but exposure. What he described as trumpets is not just chaos, but a call. What he described as bowls is not just judgment, but correction. All of this forms a timeline where causes and consequences intertwine. John saw the essence of events before seeing their manifestation. And here's the detail that almost no one mentions. John saw the beginning, saw the middle, and saw the end, all in a single vision, as if past, present, and future were folded before him. This means that understanding Revelation is not about trying to predict dates, but about discerning movements. And these movements are happening now, silently, between governments, between nations, between profound spiritual changes, between transforming human behaviors, between crises that seem merely political but have invisible roots. You feel it, don't you? An urgency in the air, a sense that the world is accelerating towards something, an impression that nothing is normal anymore, that there's a spiritual noise behind it all. It's not a false alarm, it's not paranoia, it's perception, spiritual intuition. It's exactly what John wanted to teach us, that there's a secret point where history and prophecy meet, and we live at that intersection. The signs aren't just in the newspapers, they're in humanity's internal changes, in how the masses react, in how global morality weakens, in how chaos seems to gain momentum, in the speed at which everything becomes unstable. This instability is not an accident. It's a symptom. It's part of the timeline that nobody shows, but that is wide open to anyone who really wants to see it. What no one wants to admit is that there is a sign happening now, one that isn't printed in any theology book, doesn't appear in eschatological timelines, isn't part of the memorized lists of sermons about the end, but it's there, pulsating in the middle of the world, silent, devastating, unsettling, exactly as Jesus described when he spoke about what would come like a thief, that which, no, it would be perceived by anyone too distracted by the surface of events. It's the kind of sign that doesn't appear on printed pages, but vibrates in the air, infiltrates the cycles of humanity, causes internal ruptures before any earthquake shakes the ground. It's the sign that begins as a shiver, like that feeling that something is different before anyone can rationally explain it. And that's the most disturbing part. When spiritual signs come before physical ones, the world understands nothing. But those with spiritual perception feel the impact first, as if someone had switched off an invisible light in the middle of their soul. And when we look at global events, those that the media interprets merely as politics, economics, geopolitical tensions, technological advancements, and cultural shifts, we perceive a strange pattern, a pattern that the Bible describes in the form of shadows, figures, symbols, a pattern that has repeated itself since ancient times, but which has now gained a speed never before seen in human history. Wars are not just wars. They are rearrangements of power that follow the same prophetic logic that shaped ancient empires. Crises are not just crises. They are accelerations that push humanity precisely toward the kind of scenario that the prophets described with words that many ignore. The growing division among peoples is not merely social, it is spiritual. The emotional coldness that grips people is not just a consequence of the modern world. It is the literal fulfillment of Jesus' narrative when he said that the love of many will grow cold. And the most frightening thing is that almost no one realizes that these changes didn't begin in the physical world. They began in the invisible. Before any conflict erupted, there was a shift in the spiritual atmosphere. Before the violence escalated, there was an eerie silence, as if something had been repositioned on a plane beyond the reach of the eyes. Before nations began to clash, there was a shift in the forces that govern the world. And this shift was felt by those with spiritual sensitivity as a profound unease, a discomfort that cannot be explained with simple words. This is the so-called invisible sign that Jesus mentioned, the one that would not be seen in the ordinary way, the one that would not be clearly announced, the one that would only be perceived by those who were attentive not to the phenomena, but to spirit of phenomena, Jesus made it clear that there would be signs that wouldn't be for everyone, only for those who were attentive. Signs that would be like the wind. You don't see them, but you feel them. And what is happening today is exactly that. A succession of global events that follow biblical patterns, but which are not officially recognized by any religious institution, any council, any expert. They are simply happening, silently, intensely, fitting together like pieces of a puzzle that only those who know the spiritual language can decipher. And this isn't about catastrophe for the sake of spectacle. It's about the approach of something too big to fit into human explanations. The feeling of spiritual urgency that so many people feel, even without being able to explain it, is not random. It's an anticipation. Before the world sees, the spirit perceives. Before a cycle ends, an internal pressure begins. Before history changes, the invisible moves. And when you realize this, everything changes. News ceases to be just news. Crises cease to be just crises. Global movements cease to be coincidences. Everything begins to sound like part of something bigger, a plot that is moving towards a turning point, and that point isn't on a graph, a calendar, or a map. It's in the spiritual convergence we are experiencing now. Do you feel it? That feeling that the world is accelerating towards something no one can name. That unease that seems to have no physical origin. That impression that everything is being pushed toward a dangerous alignment, as if we were reaching an invisible frontier. Because that frontier exists. It doesn't appear in the newspapers, but it's all too clear to anyone who observes. And when Jesus spoke about the end times, he didn't focus on technical details. He said, "Look at the spirit of the times," and the spirit of the times is screaming. With each event, each global disruption, each wave of instability, it becomes more evident that we are entering a prophetic moment that will not be officially declared by any authority. It will simply happen before our eyes, but will only be understood by those who are already perceiving the sign before the sign, the movement before the impact, the wind before the storm. And this is exactly where you need to pay attention. If there is an invisible sign happening, one that isn't in the books but is in the world, one that causes chills before causing physical change, one that shakes the spirit before shaking the structures, you need to decide whether you will ignore it or whether you will see what it is trying to show you. Because this whole scenario points to something we haven't yet revealed. Something that connects these global events to a prophecy that is being fulfilled before our eyes, but in a completely different way than most people imagine. If you're feeling this impact, if you've noticed something strange in the air, comment below. I feel it. What many people don't realize is that, out of fear, experts end up transforming the clear into enigma and the literal into metaphor. When we read the book of John, the academic tendency is to domesticate strong images. They transform beasts into symbols, thrones into abstractions, judgments into beautiful moral lessons. This makes sense for those who want to maintain theological tranquility, maintain institutional order, and not shake the faith of the masses. But this domestication has a price. It erases signs, softens warnings, and above all, silences the urgency that was there from the beginning. What John saw are not mere literary figures to be debated in seminars. They are scenes that vibrate with power, energy, and purpose. And to treat this as mere metaphor is to refuse the responsibility of understanding the true scope of the revelation. When you read the visions through the filter of convenience, everything becomes safe. The beast becomes the system. The woman riding the beast becomes cultural force. The seals become historical stages. And voila, the narrative fits into consensual discourses. This process removes the shock from the text and transforms it into something palatable. Experts do this for fear of losing credibility, for fear of causing panic, for fear of dismantling religious and ideological structures. But there is another consequence. By softening images that cut to the soul, they also prevent people from seeing the connection between what John witnessed and what happens in the real world. And the point is this: some images were intended to be understood literally because the literal impacts life directly and concretely. There are scenes in Revelation that weren't written to be mere metaphors. When John describes thunder, lightning, trumpets, and horses, he details phenomena that provoke human reaction: fear, repentance, a change of course. When a trumpet sounds, the effect isn't an academic reflection, it's a disruption of the story's rhythm. When the seal is broken, something is released in the spiritual world that reverberates in human history. Reducing these actions to mild metaphors misses the essential point. Prophecy influences reality. It doesn't just describe, it acts. And many experts seem to fear this direct effect. That's why they prefer a metaphorical reading that doesn't force anyone to change. The biggest problem is that, by naturalizing the text, academic interpretation creates a dangerous distance between revelation and experience. The average reader comes to believe that everything is comfortable symbolism and consequently does not develop spiritual discernment. The ability to read signs in global events, to connect political crises to spiritual movements, to perceive that certain phenomena have deeper roots than the headline suggests, is lost. The accepted metaphor comforts, but does not transform. John did not come to comfort with polite forms of language. He came to awaken, to shock, to reveal. And the interpretation that softens hides this intention. There is also a clear conflict between academic language and mystical language. Academia seeks categories, definitions, consensus. Revelation demands intimacy, risk, rapture. When someone tries to fit the impossible into a conceptual box, the impossible loses its power. And that's where fear appears. Experts know that admitting the literal can destabilize structures, can generate panic, can force radical changes in the way religious communities organize themselves. Out of fear, they prefer metaphor. Out of fear, they prefer control. Out of fear, they reduce the visceral appeal of the text to sterile debates. But we can't ignore obvious signs. At various points, John describes things with a clarity that doesn't seem to require symbolic translation. He speaks of seals, trumpets, bowls, the Lamb, and the throne, elements that produce effects in the world, that stir collective morality, that alter history. These elements act as catalysts. They break routines, unleash movements, provoke conversions or ruin. To treat this as a convenient metaphor is to deny that prophecy can be performative, that is, that the very reading, the very manifestation of the symbol has the power to alter the course of events. Furthermore, softening the imagery creates a false optimism. It's not literal, nothing needs to change in my life. That is the real danger, because the prophecy also warns of personal and collective responsibility. If everything is just metaphor, why change behavior? Why reform ethics? Why adjust spiritual priorities? A literal reading calls for repentance and action. A metaphorical reading invites complacency. The expert's fear of provoking change is a way of preserving the status quo, and this pushes the community into a comfort zone that can be fatal. There is also an embedded power dynamic. Whoever controls the interpretation controls the narrative. By pushing the symbolic into a safe realm, certain groups maintain authority over what should be done, when to act, and how to react. But the revelation was not given to serve power structures. It was given to awaken consciousness. John did not write to balance human interests. He wrote to destabilize them when necessary. The appeasing metaphor fulfills a political, not a spiritual role. And when we place revelation and academia side by side, we see the conflict in its cruelest forms. Academia wants proof, arguments, coefficients of certainty. Revelation demands faith, readiness, and courage. Literal prophecy calls for emotional involvement, behavioral change, urgency. Metaphorical prophecy calls for debates and articles. Neither will be sufficient on its own. The truth lies in the tension between them, understanding the symbols seriously without turning each image into a pretext for hysteria, accepting the literal where the text calls for action, and accepting the metaphor where the text calls for introspection. What you need to know, as a spectator and as a believer, is that systematic softening is a choice, not an inevitability. It's an accommodation strategy. And this choice has practical consequences. It reduces the sense of spiritual urgency. It pushes into oblivion signs that have been given. It increases the distance between the sacred text and daily life. If you want to see beyond the comfortable narrative, you need to learn to read with both lenses, the lens of clarity that demands change and the lens of depth that demands contemplation. Now, before we continue, consider this. How many times have you accepted a simplified interpretation simply because it was easier? How many interpretations have you heard being sold as the only truth, when in reality they were shortcuts to numb your conscience? Prophecy is not an invention to feed cheap fear. It is a call for transformation, and this call is stifled when reduced to metaphor for convenience. Before we continue, hold on to this line of reasoning, because now we enter the point that is always avoided, always softened, always transformed into theological poetry, so that no one has to face the raw truth, the secret of the throne. This is the detail that absolutely changes everything in the reading of Revelation, and it is precisely for this reason that so many experts run away, circumvent, interpret, relativize, but never confront it directly. Because the throne appears first. Before the seals, before the trumpets, before the bowls, before the judgments, before any catastrophic event or terrifying visions, what John sees is not destruction. It is the throne. And this is not a decorative order in the narrative, it is a spiritual positioning. It is as if God were saying, before you try to understand the end, you need to understand who is at the center. And yet most scholars prefer to skip this part, treating the throne as an introductory element, almost a beautiful setting, a celestial frame for the revelations that will come later. But John doesn't begin with the throne by chance. He begins because everything, absolutely everything, stems from there. And when I say everything, I'm talking about judgment, mercy, wrath, love, redemption, fall, restoration. Nothing in Revelation exists disconnected from the throne. And what is striking is that the first things John mentions are not figures, creatures, or signs, but sounds, lightning, voices, and thunder. This sequence is so specific and so repeated in Scripture that it should be impossible to ignore it. Lightning, voices, and thunder are manifestations of God's own movement, the energized manifestation of His presence. And this is not symbolic in a weak sense. It is symbolic in a sense that touches the literal. Whoever stands before the throne experiences real impact, not interpretation. Imagine trying to explain to someone who has never seen a storm what it means to stand before a stormy sky. The wind changes, the pressure changes, the air vibrates. You feel the force of nature before you see any lightning. Now imagine that multiplied by the divine presence. John didn't hear poetry. He heard sounds of governance, sounds of authority, sounds of decision. Lightning represents rupture, clarity that cuts through the darkness. Voices represent decrees, orders released into eternity. Thunder represents impact, spiritual reverberation that traverses human history. These elements don't appear as an aesthetic introduction. They announce that the throne is a judicial center. Before any judgment manifests in the narrative, the throne is already judging. That's why it appears first. And that's exactly what scares experts. Because this perspective dismantles the comfortable reading that many religious institutions uphold. If the throne is the center of revelation, and if everything already begins around it, then there is no spiritual neutrality. There is no, let's wait and see how the end times will be. Everything is already happening because everything already originates from the throne. And this detail, this single detail, completely changes how the text should be read. We are not observing isolated events. We are observing direct responses to the decree of the one who sits at the center of the spiritual universe. And notice, John doesn't try to over-explain. He doesn't try to translate the throne. He doesn't try to embellish. He describes, he recounts, he remains silent about what he doesn't know. Meanwhile, modern experts do the opposite. They over-explain. They over-rationalize. They over-deconstruct. They transform lightning into symbols of purification, voices into internal spiritual dynamics, thunder into metaphors of emotional impact. Not because it's in the text, but because it diminishes the weight of the literal. Because the literal demands reverence, demands fear, demands humility. Three things that many people have lost in modern religious reading. And there's another point no one wants to face. Lightning, voices, and thunder are not static. They are signs of movement. This means that the throne is not a throne sitting in a static room in heaven. It is a living throne, a throne that decides, that vibrates, that acts, a throne that manifests itself, a throne that responds to the state of the world. This implies that the end times are not merely a mechanical sequence of prophetic events, but a living conversation between the Creator and creation. This stirs human fear because it means that God is not distant, observing from afar. He is active. And what comes after the throne is not cold destiny, it is consequence. This understanding completely changes the tone of the apocalypse. The narrative ceases to be chaos and becomes order. It ceases to be terror and becomes direction. Terror, fear, only dominates those who see the end without seeing the throne. That's why experts avoid this point, because placing the throne before everything requires you to recognize authority, sovereignty, divine decision. And that's the part that's frightening. It's not the beast, it's not the mark, it's not the catastrophes, it's the throne. Because the throne means that we are not protagonists of the story, we are part of it. And when you accept that, your ego dies. And many people prefer to face prophetic monsters than to face the death of their own spiritual ego. The throne also reveals another truth. Revelation doesn't begin with fear. It begins with reverence. That's why John falls as if dead in other parts of the vision. It's not because of the horror of what's to come, but because of the grandeur of what lies before him. Lightning and thunder aren't signs of chaos. They're signs of presence. They're signs that the spiritual atmosphere is charged, alive, alert, and that should bring awe, but it should also bring comfort, because the world isn't adrift. Nothing happens without passing through the center. Nothing is released by chance. Every seal, every trumpet, every judgment is filtered through the throne, the place where love and justice coexist without conflict. And if this is true, and John insists it is, then you need to understand that the throne comes first to teach the correct order of prophecy. First sovereignty, then revelation. First the king, then the plan. First the presence, then the impact. This order avoids spiritual hysteria and also avoids interpretative arrogance. It is this order that sustains revelation. It is this order that keeps the text in balance, and it is this order that so many scholars ignore because it demands a change of posture. You don't read Revelation as one who tries to unravel an enigma. You read it as one who stands before a king. And before moving on to the next part, I want you to participate with me here, because this helps the video reach more people and shows me who is truly connected with this revelation. Comment at the end with, "The throne comes first," or "I heard the thunder." Choose one of these phrases and post it in the comments. I want to see who understands the weight of this part of the vision and who is ready for the continuation. So let's continue exactly where we left off, now delving into territory that many avoid because it touches on historical, spiritual, and academic fundamentals all at once. And that's precisely what makes this next topic so uncomfortable for specialists and so essential for anyone who truly wants to understand end times prophecies, the forbidden parallel between history and prophecy. This is where many people get lost, not because it's too complicated, but because it's too simple. And simplicity sometimes reveals things that the system would prefer to leave buried. The truth is that history doesn't move in a straight line. It repeats itself, it echoes, it creates patterns. And when you begin to see these patterns, prophecies cease to seem metaphysical and begin to seem familiar, recognizable. As if each generation had lived a shadow of what is to come, an anticipation, a rehearsal, a reflection. And this is what many experts don't want to admit, that ancient events are not just memories, but spiritual cycles. Have you noticed that certain global crises resemble others from the past, as if they were amplified repetitions? Have you noticed that certain conflicts involving Israel, a nation that always appears in prophecies, follow a logic that spans centuries? Have you noticed that biblical symbols return at specific moments in history? This is not a coincidence. The Bible has always treated time as a spiral, not as a line. And John, there on Patmos, saw this exact movement, events that echo others, patterns that return, shadows that announce what is about to happen again, only on a final scale. When you look at Israel, for example, you realize that everything there functions like a prophetic clock. Not because it's poetic to think that way, but because the history of the people of Israel has always moved in cycles, dispersion and return, fall and restoration, silence and revelation, war and promise. And what's most impressive is that these cycles align perfectly with the great turning points in world history. But this is rarely explained openly. Why? Because recognizing this pattern is admitting that the past is pointing to something, and that something is exactly what prophecy describes. Think about it. How many times has humanity faced empires that seemed global? How many times have leaders with messianic speeches emerged? How many times have they tried to unify peoples, languages, and nations under a single system? The Bible speaks of this as something future. But history shows it repeatedly, and always in cycles that prepare the ground. This doesn't mean that past events were the end of times, but it means they were shadows, rehearsals, patterns. And that's what John saw so clearly. Prophecy is not an isolated event, it's the culmination of a pattern that has been pulsing in history for thousands of years. And it's curious how nobody talks about this. Experts prefer to completely separate history and prophecy as if they were two disconnected things. But they are not. They never were. God himself commanded Israel to remember the past because it contained the code to the future. And when you begin to see this, the feeling is exactly what many are afraid to admit. Everything makes sense now. The ancient persecution is a mirror of the future. The ancient exile is a shadow of the final judgment. The ancient kingdoms are prototypes of the final systems. The spiritual rebellion of past eras is the harbinger of the ultimate rebellion. The restoration of Israel is not only historical, it is prophetic. And the more you observe how history and prophecy walk hand in hand, the more you realize that the apocalypse did not arise from nothing. It is the climax of something that has always existed. And there's more. Those moments when historical events seem to align by chance with prophecies are precisely the moments that experts avoid commenting on. But you, who are here with me, know very well that too much coincidence becomes a pattern, and too much pattern becomes a message, and too much message becomes a warning. The apocalypse is full of symbolism that has appeared before, and that is why reading the end times requires understanding the shadows that preceded it. John saw a future that, in a way, had already happened before. Not in its fullness, but in the form of a warning. The very structure of Revelation echoes narrative structures from the history of Israel. Liberation, judgment, fall, restoration, the same cycle. Only in the end, this cycle closes in an absolute, definitive, irreversible way. And this means that the past is not just memory, it's a map. When you read certain passages of Scripture and compare them with historical events, you realize that some ancient events were prophetic miniatures. And this explains why many refuse to connect these two spheres, because when you connect them, you realize that the future is not as distant as we imagined. And look, pay attention to this. There is something profoundly spiritual when the past aligns with the future, because it shows that God doesn't act impulsively. He repeats patterns to teach, he repeats shadows to prepare, he repeats signs to warn, and those people who say, "This has happened before, so it's not prophetic," are precisely the ones who don't understand that the fact that it happened before is exactly what confirms its prophetic nature. The shadow confirms the light. The rehearsal confirms the performance. The past confirms the future. History confirms the prophecy. And this is the part I want you to reflect on more deeply. If ancient events continue to repeat themselves, if Israel's trajectory remains aligned with global movements, if spiritual symbols emerge in different eras, as if trying to grab our attention, then perhaps we are not spectators of coincidences, but participants in a cycle that is nearing completion. And that's why you're here, following this series, seeking to understand what many ignore, because deep down you feel there's something in the air, something returning, something echoing, something being repeated as a spiritual clue. They hide it because they know that if that piece falls on the table, the whole castle of comfortable explanations collapses. The great omission by the experts is not a technical detail, it is not an academic disagreement, it is not an alternative interpretation of the prophecy. It is an uncomfortable truth because it exposes that judgment is not just a future event, not a distant day, not an isolated moment in which the whole world will tremble at the same time. The truth is more raw, more direct, more uncomfortable. The trial is a process, a cycle that spans generations, nations, empires, and even entire religions. And that's precisely why almost no one touches on this point, because admitting it would reorganize the entire theology that keeps gigantic structures standing. And when you look at the pattern, it repeats itself with a chilling precision. First comes moral or spiritual decay, then collective blindness, followed by a deceptive calm, and finally a collapse that seems unexpected, but which has actually been building for decades. And the most frightening thing, each phase of the trial appears to be active in different places at the same time. It's as if the world were divided into spiritual temporal zones, where some nations are already facing consequences, while others are still trapped in the illusion of security. Realize the depth of this. We are not waiting for the beginning of anything. We are already in one of the phases. And when this idea clicks, everything changes. Because it's not about cheap apocalyptic fear. It's about recognizing that the prophetic scenario is not just a prediction, but a diagnosis. The descriptions of deception, national arrogance, tensions between peoples, and recurring crises all form a mosaic that doesn't point to one day, but to a global transition that has already begun. And this would explain why events that should have shocked the entire world were swallowed up by routine, as if they were part of a natural flow. They are not. They are signs, They are markers. They are reminders that something bigger is moving. Now consider the impact this realization would have on entire religions. If religious leaders admitted that judgment is already underway, not as a final punishment but as a progressive spiritual process, it would destroy entire narratives built upon the idea that it hasn't started yet. It would take away from institutions the control of when. It would remove the psychological comfort that keeps millions of people paralyzed, waiting for something that is, in fact, already happening around them. Omission, then, is not ignorance. It is strategy. It is maintaining stability. It is avoiding a global shock of conscience. But the truth is simple. There is no longer any way to deny the accumulated signs. Whether you look at seemingly endless crises, growing polarization, shamelessly exploding moral collapse, the fragmentation of nations, or even the sense of accelerated time that people have been reporting, it all points to an ongoing process. And when you read ancient texts with non-religious but observant eyes, you realize they describe the same pattern happening at different times, always with the same rhythm. First the subtle warning, then the growing unease, and finally the revelation. The revelation never comes out of nowhere. It is always prepared by the previous generation. And perhaps the most disturbing point is this. If we are already within one of the phases of judgment, then what many consider to be the beginning is, in fact, already halfway there. And that is why so many experts prefer to avoid the subject, because they can no longer promise security, they can no longer guarantee distance from the events, they can no longer maintain the narrative that all this belongs to the future. This truth demands responsibility now. It demands vigilance now. It demands a spiritual posture now. And admitting this means confronting the harsh reality that we have already crossed a line. And here's the detail that's even more unsettling. When you begin to understand this progression, you realize that certain nations are being weighed, evaluated, and repositioned. You see some peoples entering phases of spiritual collapse while others begin to awaken. The judgment is not just destruction, it's separation, it's purification, it's reorganization. And if this process is continuous, it means that nothing we are seeing today is accidental. It's part of a larger transition that connects past and future. And the silence of the experts is precisely what amplifies this impact. Because when you put it all together, when you realize that the sacred past repeats itself in almost mathematical cycles, the feeling is brutal. Everything makes sense now. And here's a direct question. If you truly understand that the trial is already underway, what part do you believe we're experiencing? Comment on this at the end. Say what phase you think the world is in now. Or, if you want to delve deeper, write, "It has already begun," just so I know you've grasped the point. And also tell me if you already suspected this omission. I want to see how awake this audience is, because what follows requires courage to face the next level of the narrative. Most people get lost because they view prophecies as if they were a horror movie, as if each symbol were a threat, as if each vision were a sentence of destruction. This is the mistake that distorts everything. Reading Revelation as a narrative of panic, when in fact it is a codification of transformation. It is not an announcement of the end, it is a map of transition. And when the lens is wrong, everything loses its meaning. The person reads fall, but does not see purification. Reads chaos, but does not perceive reconstruction. Reads judgment, but does not see separation and purpose. And this misconception is repeated because many people have never understood the divine logic behind chaos. Nothing is destroyed without first being revealed. Nothing is removed without first being exposed. Nothing is shaken without first being weighed. Chaos is not the message, it is the instrument. And as long as you don't understand this, the book becomes just a literary monster made to scare. But when you understand, when the key turns, when the symbol opens, the feeling is one that only those who have had a spiritual epiphany know. Now everything makes sense. And here's the part people ignore because they lack context. Prophetic language was never written for a modern, literal, immediate mind. It's symbolic, cyclical, interconnected with patterns that repeat themselves in the spiritual history of peoples, empires, and even individuals. That's why those who read prophecies with today's mindset only see catastrophe. They see earthquakes, fire, falling stars, and think it's all literal destruction. But that's just the surface. Symbolic reading reveals another narrative: the fall of systems, the fall of powers, the fall of structures. When the text speaks of trumpets, it's talking about announcements. When it speaks of bowls, it speaks of accumulated consequences. When it speaks of seals, it speaks of phases that are opened as humanity matures spiritually. But because it lacks depth, it lacks background, it lacks connection with the rest of Scripture, the reading becomes a jumble of frightening visions. And that's exactly what needs to be corrected for people to finally see prophecy as it really is, a process of reordering. And this becomes even clearer when you understand that terror is not the content, but the human reaction to the unknown. When a prophecy points to collapse, it is talking about what needs to be removed. When it points to war, it is talking about spiritual disputes that are reflected on the surface. When it speaks of persecution, it is talking about the system's resistance to the awakening of people who begin to see beyond. The mistake lies in thinking that everything is literal and that everything is physical destruction. This paralyzes, this confuses, this blocks understanding. And it is precisely here that divine logic reveals itself. Chaos only exists because something is being reorganized. The hand that knocks down is the same that lifts up. The hand that exposes is the same that restores. This completely changes the way you read the text. And there's another crucial point that almost no one realizes. Many people only read Revelation in isolation without looking at the context that comes before, at the promises, at the cycles, at the repeated patterns. It's like trying to understand the end of a movie without having seen the beginning. Prophecy is based on the past, echoes in the present, and points to the future, all at the same time. When someone ignores this, everything becomes distorted. That's why so many people are frightened by symbols that weren't made to frighten, but to reveal. That's why many people fear the Antichrist, without understanding that the text never focuses on an individual, but on an opposing system. That's why many fear the end of the world, without understanding that the text speaks of the end of eras, of spiritual cycles, of systems that need to be finalized so that others can emerge. Context is lacking. Structure is lacking. A complete reading is lacking. And when you put that understanding on the table, something powerful happens. You stop reading prophecies with fear and start reading them with clarity. You realize that chaos is part of the transition, that collapse is preparation, that what seems like destruction is, in fact, the removal of what no longer serves. And this positions you in another category of spiritual awareness, because you begin to identify these patterns in the real world. The fall of arrogant nations, the exposure of corrupt systems, crises that reveal the fragility of empires that seemed eternal, and the emergence of new blocks, exactly as occurs in ancient cycles. Prophetic reading ceases to be a threat and becomes a compass. And that is the difference between those who read out of fear and those who read out of understanding. And there's another detail that's worth its weight in gold. When you understand the symbolic language of prophecy, you realize that it speaks directly to our time, not as a warning of total destruction, but as a confirmation that we are in the midst of a gigantic reconstruction. And this has nothing to do with foolish optimism. It has to do with mature spiritual reading. It has to do with seeing the hidden movement behind the visible chaos. It has to do with recognizing that there is an invisible order guiding a global transition. Prophecy then ceases to be a book of tragedies and becomes a manual of lucidity. It separates those who are lost in fear from those who are awake in understanding. There is a point in any prophecy, and especially in apocalyptic prophecies, of no return, a threshold, a cut, an invisible line that, when crossed, changes the nature of events. And that's exactly what almost no one wants to admit. There is a moment when the prophecy ceases to be a prediction and becomes an ongoing reality. And when that moment arrives, the feeling changes, the atmosphere changes, the world changes. It's as if something is breathing behind the events, something big, something that has always been there, but that now manifests itself with enough force to be perceived by ordinary people. The prophecy ceases to be a concept, ceases to be a theory, ceases to be a distant possibility, and becomes what is literally happening before our eyes. It is the point of no return, and we have already crossed it, although very few are ready to admit it. This point of no return is the instant when spiritual and global signs align so precisely, so repetitively, and so intensely that they cease to be coincidence. It's when historical cycles begin to echo with the kind of precision that the scriptures have described for centuries. It's when spiritual, geopolitical, social and cultural patterns converge, as if obeying the same internal logic. And whenever this happens, prophecy awakens. Reality begins to speak the same language that John described. And the most impressive thing is that this convergence doesn't happen suddenly, but gradually, like waves that increase until, suddenly, they become a tide. The problem is that many only realize it when the tide is already up to their necks, and that's why so many experts avoid admitting the obvious. The signs have already gone beyond traditional historical boundaries. And when I speak of global signs, I'm not just talking about physical events, but about profound, almost palpable spiritual changes. Changes in the atmosphere, changes in people's spiritual sensitivity, changes in the behavior of nations. It's a type of movement that doesn't begin in governments, but in the invisible backstage of existence. First, it happens on the spiritual plane. Then physical reality follows. And this is something that all the prophets have always said, but that the modern world ignores. Great transitions never begin with earthquakes or wars. They begin with changes in consciousness, in perception, in the invisible structures that sustain the world. When these structures begin to vibrate, the physical signs are merely a consequence, and it is precisely this understanding that is lacking when experts analyze what is happening now. Because yes, we've already passed the limit. It's not a prediction, it's not a theory, it's not a projection, it's direct spiritual observation. The world has already entered the phase where certain promises, certain warnings, and certain cycles can no longer be deactivated. The prophetic wheel has already turned. The gears have already meshed. It's the stage where humanity begins to reap what has been accumulating for centuries. And this isn't fear-mongering, it's pure spiritual reading. It's that feeling that many people try to ignore, but that returns every time they look at the news, the weather, the conflicts, the behavior of the masses, the global polarization, the moral collapse. It's that feeling of something very wrong is happening in the world, but that almost no one can name. And this is where the point of no return comes in, when collective perception begins to feel the impact of what the scriptures had already described. And what is most striking and frightening is that a large part of the experts know this. They know how to recognize patterns, they know how to read ancient texts, they know how to connect historical events. They know how to identify recurring cycles, They even know that we are going through an era of spiritual tension never seen before with this intensity. But they don't speak up. They don't admit it. They don't declare it. Because admitting this means tampering with religious, academic, and political structures. It means facing resistance. It means confronting the fact that theological comfort is over, that allegorical interpretations are no longer sufficient to explain what is happening. And it is much easier to say that it's a coincidence, that it's an exaggeration, that it's just a phase, than to admit the truth. We are closer than it seems, and that phrase carries weight. Because when you truly understand what it means to be close, something tightens inside your chest, not out of panic but out of awareness. It's as if you finally realize that the world is moving in an inevitable direction. And it doesn't matter if you believe it or not. Prophecy doesn't depend on acceptance. It depends on fulfillment. And when reality begins to obey the prophetic pattern, it means we're already on the script. We've passed the point of interpretation. Now, we're in the phase of recognition, recognizing that cultural, social, and spiritual boundaries are imploding simultaneously, recognizing that what was considered impossible is becoming normal, recognizing that events that previously occurred in isolation are now happening in sequence, as if orchestrated to prepare the global stage. And this shakes things up. It shakes things up because we can no longer pretend that humanity is living in an ordinary era. We can no longer look at the changes and think they are just natural phenomena. We can no longer see the acceleration of events and label it as chance. When prophecy and reality meet, the world enters a completely different kind of vibration, a state of constant spiritual tension. People feel it, even if they can't explain it. It's that silent restlessness. It's that inner discomfort. It's that feeling that the world is heavier, faster, more intense, more chaotic. This is the mark of the point of no return, and few have the courage to face it head-on. And perhaps you've felt this too, this strange acceleration, as if time were compressed, as if events were happening faster than the mind can process, as if there were a spiritual urgency hovering over everything. This is not imagination. This is a sign. This is a symptom. This is confirmation. It's as if the whole world is entering the same prophetic field at the same time. And when that happens, there is no turning back. There is no slowing down. There is no pause. Prophecy advances like a tide, pushing everything, rearranging everything, revealing everything. And this is where you realize why this topic is so avoided. Because admitting this means accepting that the current scenario is not random, it is fulfillment. And before we move on to the next part, which will be even more intense, I want you to tell me in the comments if you also feel that we've crossed a point of no return. If you want to summarize it in code so I can identify who's really following along, comment "It's over." This helps me understand who is truly awake. And now we arrive at the point where everything converges. After traversing signs, patterns, ignored prophecies, distorted metaphors, deliberate omissions, and this point of no return that separates the world we knew from the world that is already emerging, there is one question that cuts deeper than all the others, a question that, if you have the courage to face it, changes how you see the apocalypse and changes how you see yourself. A question that no one asks, but that should be the first. What if the biggest secret of the end times isn't about when, but about you? Because that's the truth no one talks about. Everyone wants to know dates, events, signs, conflicts, who's who, what will happen, when it will happen, what the order will be, what the next step will be. It's as if the whole world is looking at the sky, trying to decipher codes, maps, signs and alignments, while ignoring what's vibrating inside their own hearts. Most get lost trying to decipher it. When the end comes, but you don't realize that, for many people, the end has already begun from within. And I don't mean this in a negative way, quite the opposite. I mean it in the deepest and most spiritual sense possible. The apocalypse begins within the soul before it happens in the world. That's why so many feel restless, weighed down, urgent, uncomfortable, rushed, a sense of acceleration, the impression that something invisible is messing with everything. It's not just the world that's changing, it's people. The apocalypse isn't just the revelation of the end, it's the revelation of what we truly are, what we carry, what we hide, what we pretend not to see. It's as if, before God exposes the truth of the world, he exposes the individual truth. And that's why this question is so devastating. What if the focus of this entire prophecy isn't when it all ends, but who are you when it all begins? Think about it. What good is understanding the order of the seals, the trumpets, the bowls, the visions, and the signs, if inside you remain trapped in the same patterns that distance you from the truth? What good is knowing how to read the prophecies out there if you can't read what's happening inside you? Most people think the apocalypse is a movie happening in the sky, when in reality it's a mirror placed in front of the soul. And this mirror reveals something that no one can escape. Everything you are, everything you carry, everything you build or destroy appears there, unfiltered, unapologetically, without narrative, without a mask. This is the true judgment. Not the one the world fears, the external, cosmic, dramatic judgment, but the internal, silent, inevitable judgment. What you do when no one is watching. What you think when no one is listening, what you nurture within yourself, what you endure, what you reject, what you resist, what you allow. The part of the prophecy that no one admits is that the end times, before being an event, is a revelation. And revelation in its purest sense means exposure. It means shining a light in places you never wanted to illuminate. It means the heart being turned inside out. And here's the impactful conclusion of this video. The apocalypse doesn't begin with trumpets in the sky. It begins when your soul awakens to what you need to change. That's why so many people feel something calling, pulling, pressing from within. It's as if the human spirit is being invited or pushed to wake up, to see beyond the surface, to realize that spiritual time doesn't follow the same rhythm as the clock. To understand that prophecies aren't just warnings, they're invitations. Invitations to transformation. And transformation always begins from the inside out. So, let me ask you with all sincerity, and I want you to feel this question sinking deep into your consciousness. If the apocalypse began within you today, what would it reveal? Not the world, not governments, not nations, not structures. You. What would he find inside? Strength or escape? Faith or apathy? Truth or disguise? Purpose or stagnation? This is the question that defines everything. This is the question that decides who is prepared, not for the end, but for the revelation. And that's the point. Perhaps the greatest secret of the end times isn't a cosmic event, isn't a hidden date, isn't a prophetic code. Perhaps the greatest secret is that God is more interested in transforming people than in destroying systems. Perhaps the focus is on showing who we truly are when everything superficial crumbles, when the world trembles on the outside, but the soul trembles on the inside. Perhaps that's why so many people feel something calling them closer, as if an internal adjustment is happening silently. And I want to leave you with this reflection echoing, not as a warning, but as a mirror. Who are you becoming as the world approaches its own final chapter? Because in the end, it doesn't matter which prophecy you deciphered, which sign you identified, which event you connected. What determines everything is who you are when the truth is revealed. And that no one can hide. Before we wrap up, answer in the comments. I really want to know who's here with me until the end. Comment, I see, if that last question resonated with you in any way, or leave a comment. I woke up, If this idea that the apocalypse begins within the soul makes sense to you, it shows me who is truly keeping up with this awakening. If you've made it this far, it's because something inside you has been stirred, so don't waste it. Hit the subscribe button now, because the next video is already calling your name, and you know you don't want to miss what's coming. Leave a like, comment on what gave you the most goosebumps in this episode, and continue the journey by clicking on the video on the screen. Go, don't wait. The mystery only deepens from here on out.